I watched them through the rain-speckled window of Driftwood Coffee House, laughing as they shared a single umbrella entering the gleaming office building across the street. My husband Rob and the woman he'd been sleeping with for the past 8 months, Natalie, his so-called executive assistant. They looked so carefree, so comfortable together, stepping into the prestigious Cascade Financial Partners building where Rob had built his investment career. The same career I had supported through years of late nights, networking events, and financial sacrifices. I sipped my lavender honey latte slowly, my position in the window alcove offering the perfect vantage point for this surreal scene. 4 weeks ago, I'd moved out without explanation. Not a text, not a note. I simply vanished from our life together, taking only what I could carry in 2 suitcases and my laptop. I left behind my clothes, my books, my grandmother's china collection, and most importantly, the deed to our historic Craftsman home in Laurelhurst, securely transferred to a safe deposit box only I could access. Rob hadn't bothered filing a missing person report. Not that I expected him to. Our marriage had been disintegrating for years, held together by dinner parties, shared investments, and the persistent facade of success we projected to our social circle. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly he'd move Natalie into our home once I disappeared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another coffee, please, I said to Zoe, the barista with the nose ring and kind eyes who'd been keeping my cup filled for the past 2 hours. From my cozy corner, I had an unobstructed view as Rob held the door, open for Natalie, his hand lingering just a bit too long on the small of her back. They were practically giddy. The wife was gone, and now they could play house together in a $1. $8 million restored Craftsman in Portland's most prestigious neighborhood. If only Rob had paid attention during the closing 3 years ago. If only he'd noticed that the deed was solely in my name, a protective measure I'd insisted upon after watching my college roommate lose everything in her divorce. Rob had been too busy impressing our real estate agent with market predictions and renovation plans to bother with such minor details. My phone vibrated with a text from Marcus, my attorney. Meeting confirmed tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. All documents. Prepared. Final chance to reconsider approach. I typed back immediately. Proceeding as planned. Let them enjoy the weekend first. My gaze drifted back to the building just as the elevator in the lobby whisked them upward. I could picture it vividly. Natalie's wide-eyed excitement as Rob showed her his corner office with its view of Mount Hood, introduced her to colleagues as his new executive assistant, while their shared glances conveyed a very different relationship. I checked my watch. By now, they'd have discovered that most of my belongings were still in our home. My clothes still hanging in the closet, my books still lining the shelves, my skincare products still arranged on the bathroom counter, an abandoned life preserved like a museum exhibit. Rob would be confused but relieved, assuming I'd left, in a crisis and would eventually return, contrite and apologetic. He didn't understand that I'd left those things behind, not out of haste but calculation. Everything in that house had been inventoried, photographed, and legally documented by my legal team. Every item would become evidence of what was about to unfold. Zoe refilled my cup and lingered at my table. You've been watching that building all morning. Friend of yours work there? I took a slow sip before answering. My husband does. Or I should say, my soon-to-be ex-husband. Zoe's eyebrows raised slightly. Sounds like there's a story there. There is, I conceded with a small smile. But it's still being written. I'd met Rob 11 years ago at a charity auction for the hospital where I worked as an administrator. He was charming, ambitious, with that polished confidence that came from an Ivy League education and family connections. As an up-and-coming advisor at Cascade Financial, he spoke eloquently about investment strategies and market opportunities, dropping names and figures with practiced ease. I was impressed, but not for the reasons he assumed. Behind his well-rehearsed presentation, I recognized something familiar, the same hunger for success that had driven me from my middle-class upbringing to my executive position. The same determination to build something meaningful, to create security. We married 14 months later in what society columns called a perfect merger of healthcare and finance. For a while, it was beautiful. We renovated our Craftsman home, hosted the right dinner parties, joined the right clubs, made the right investments. Rob's career flourished. He eventually became a senior advisor with his own client portfolio. I orchestrated our personal finances with the same precision I brought to hospital budgets, quietly building a safety net that Rob rarely questioned. It was during our 7th year together that the first cracks appeared. Rob started coming home. Later, his explanations about client meetings growing vague. The cologne he wore changed subtly. His phone became a closely guarded possession. Classic signs, so predictable they were almost insulting to my intelligence. I hired a private investigator not out of jealousy or even surprise, but out of a practical need to assess my situation. The reports confirmed my suspicions. Dinner meetings extending into nightcaps at hotel bars, weekend conferences that involved minimal attendance at actual sessions. Still, I held my cards close. Confrontation wasn't my style. It only gave the other person time to prepare their defense. Instead, I started making preparations of my own. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Grace, my best friend and the hospital's legal counsel. "How's the surveillance going? Need company?" I replied. "All clear for now. Dinner tonight?" Grace had been my confidant throughout this process, helping me prepare for the long game, setting up the network of professionals I'd need: forensic accountants, investigators, specialized attorneys. She understood why I couldn't just walk away or confront Rob directly. Some betrayals demanded a more sophisticated response. Across the street, a light flickered on in Rob's office window. I could picture Natalie exploring the space, running her fingers along his mahogany desk, admiring the framed certifications on the wall, perhaps wondering if they should go shopping this weekend to replace my things. After all, I'd been gone, for 4 weeks without communication. Surely I wasn't coming back. What they didn't know was that I'd been documenting their activities meticulously. I had footage of the first night Natalie had stayed over, just 4 days after my disappearance. I had recordings of them bringing in her suitcases, ordering champagne delivery, arriving home together at hours that made it clear she wasn't just visiting. All evidence of abandonment of the marital property, of disrespect for the marriage before any formal separation. Evidence that would prove valuable very soon. The real turning point came 5 months ago when Rob was passed over for partnership at Cascade Financial. The position went to Eliza Winters, a brilliant strategist with impeccable credentials whom Rob had previously dismissed as too academic for client work. Rob had been livid, convinced he'd been robbed of what he deserved. He became reckless, leasing a new luxury car, buying custom suits, purchasing expensive gifts that never seemed to make it home to me. Unknown to Rob, I'd been tracking our finances meticulously. I watched as our joint accounts dwindled while my separate accounts, the ones he didn't know about, remained untouched. I observed as he made increasingly risky investments, trying to prove himself worthy of the position he'd lost. And I said nothing, allowing him to believe I was still the supportive, somewhat naive wife who trusted his financial expertise implicitly. What Rob failed to understand was that I had been the financial backbone of our marriage from the beginning. My salary had always been higher, my investments more conservative but ultimately more profitable. The down payment for our house had come from my inheritance when my grandparents passed away. I'd kept these details subtle, knowing how important it was for Rob to believe he was the primary provider. My phone lit up with another text from Grace. "Just got wind of something big. Cascade Financial is under federal investigation for regulatory violations." several advisors being scrutinized for client management practices. I knew about the investigation. It had been brewing for months. Cascade had been cutting corners, pushing the boundaries of acceptable practice. Rob wasn't directly implicated, but his department was under scrutiny. The firm's reputation was suffering, clients were getting nervous, and Rob's own investments, tied closely to company stock options, were in jeopardy, which explained his increasingly desperate moves in recent weeks. I'd noticed substantial withdrawals from our joint savings account, money being moved into high-risk ventures. Rob was trying to gamble his way out of trouble, unaware that I'd already protected most of our assets. I finished my latte and left a generous tip for Zoe. It was time to move to the next phase of my plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I walked to my car, not the luxury SUV Rob knew, but a modest sedan I'd leased 3 months ago through my private LLC, I took one last look at the office building. Our life together had been built on a foundation of mutual ambition and respect. When Rob shattered that foundation with his betrayal, he forgot one crucial detail. I was the architect of our financial structure, not him. Tomorrow, Rob and Natalie would leave for what they assumed would be a romantic weekend at his family's cabin near Mount Hood. They'd return Sunday evening to find the locks changed, a security system they couldn't override, and legal notices waiting for them. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, I had dinner with Grace, followed by final preparations with Marcus. The end game was approaching, and timing was everything. At Riverview Restaurant, where Grace was already waiting at our reserved table. I checked my reflection in the entryway mirror. Composed, confident, not a hair out of place. Nothing in my appearance suggested a woman whose marriage was imploding. Nothing revealed the calculated determination beneath my carefully maintained facade. "You look terrifyingly calm," Grace observed as I slid into the booth across from her. "I don't know whether to be impressed or concerned." "Be impressed," I said, accepting the glass of Pinot Noir she'd already ordered for me. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." Grace leaned forward, lowering her voice despite our private table. "And you're absolutely certain the house is legally yours? No loopholes he could exploit?" "Absolutely certain," I replied, taking a small sip of wine. "The deed is in my name only. I paid the down payment from my separate account. I handled all the property taxes through my personal accounts. Rob's name doesn't appear on a single document related to ownership." "And he never questioned this arrangement?" I allowed myself a small smile. Rob has always been more interested in appearances than details. As long as he could boast about our historic Craftsman at dinner parties, he never bothered to verify whose name was actually on the deed. Grace shook her head, both amused and appalled. "Men like Rob never see women like you coming, do they?" "That's what makes this possible," I replied, studying the menu though I already knew what I would order. He underestimated me from the beginning, first as an asset, then as an opponent. Our conversation paused as the server approached. We ordered, maintaining the appearance of two friends enjoying a casual dinner. Once we were alone again, Grace pulled out her tablet, switching to business mode. "I've reviewed all the documentation from the forensic accountants," she said. "Rob has been systematically moving money from your joint accounts into private ones for the past 6 months. Some of it was used for gifts for Natalie, jewelry, weekend getaways, that sort of thing. But the bulk appears to be an attempt to shield assets in anticipation of a potential divorce." I nodded, unsurprised. "Which plays perfectly into our hands. Hiding marital assets is frowned upon by divorce courts." "There's more," Grace continued, her expression grim. "He's been lying about the firm's stability. Cascade Financial is under more serious investigation than previously reported. Rumors of regulatory actions coming within weeks. Rob's position is particularly vulnerable." This was new information, but it didn't change my strategy. If anything, it accelerated my timeline. Rob would be even more desperate now, more likely to make mistakes. Do you think he moved Natalie in so quickly because he's about to lose everything? Grace asked, setting up a backup plan? I considered this, taking a measured sip of wine. Possibly. Or perhaps he truly believes I'll never come back. Either way, it demonstrates his character, or lack thereof. Our food arrived, and we ate with the efficiency of two professionals accustomed to working lunches and strategic discussions. Between bites, we finalized details for the coming week. The locksmith scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, the security team on standby, the formal notices prepared by Marcus. What about your personal items still in the house? Grace asked, signaling for the check. Aren't you worried about what might happen to them? Everything of true value, financially or sentimentally, is already secured, I assured her. What remains is either replaceable or strategically left behind. Besides, we have detailed inventory and photographic evidence of everything in that house. If a single item goes missing, it becomes another point in our favor. Grace studied me with a mixture of admiration and concern. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had years to prepare, I replied simply. Later that night in my temporary apartment, a sleek, minimalist space in a secure downtown building, I reviewed the final preparations for tomorrow. The locksmith was confirmed for 1 p.m. When surveillance confirmed Rob and Natalie would be well on their way to the cabin. The security team would arrive at 1:30 to install the new system and remain on site until Sunday evening. Marcus would deliver the legal notices at 2 p.m., ensuring everything was properly documented. I opened my laptop and checked the tracking app I'd installed on Rob's phone months ago, another piece of insurance I'd never expected to need. The dot showed him at our house, my house, presumably settling in for the night with Natalie. Tomorrow, morning. They'd pack for their weekend getaway, blissfully unaware of what awaited them upon their return. As I prepared for bed, I felt no sadness, no regret, not even anger anymore. Those emotions had burned away months ago, leaving only cool determination in their place. Rob had made his choices. Now it was time for him to face the consequences. My phone buzzed with a final text from Marcus. Everything in place for tomorrow. Last chance to reconsider approach. More conventional options still available. I typed my response without hesitation. Proceed as planned. They deserve the weekend of false security before reality hits. Setting my phone aside, I slipped. Between cool sheets and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end for Rob's comfortable illusions. By this time next week, he would understand exactly who he had betrayed. Not the compliant, supportive wife he thought he knew, but a woman who had anticipated his every move and prepared accordingly. A woman who owned the very roof over his head and was about to reclaim it. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched my state of mind. I rose early, completed my yoga routine, and dressed with particular care. A tailored charcoal suit that projected authority, my grandmother's pearl earrings, and subtle makeup that enhanced rather than concealed. Today wasn't about confrontation. Rob and Natalie would be long gone before any of my team arrived at the house. Today was about preparation, about setting the stage for Sunday's revelation. My phone buzzed with a text from my surveillance contact. Subjects loading car now, estimated departure within 20 minutes. Perfect timing. I gathered my essentials and headed out, not to the house, but to Marcus's office for our final briefing. As I drove, I allowed myself to picture Rob and Natalie's faces when they returned from their romantic weekend to find themselves locked out of my home. Legal notices demanding their immediate and permanent departure. The thought brought a small, satisfied smile to my face as I navigated through Portland's morning traffic. Marcus Thompson's law office occupied the 12th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise, all polished concrete, glass, and understated luxury. The reception area of Thompson and Rivera featured minimalist furnishings, strategic lighting, and abstract art that subtly conveyed power and competence. This wasn't a place that specialized in amicable divorces or friendly separations. This was where you came when you needed legal warfare conducted with surgical precision. "Emma," Marcus greeted me, emerging from his corner office exactly on time. His handshake was firm, his smile measured but genuine. At 58, Marcus Thompson had built his reputation as the most feared divorce attorney in 3 counties. He specialized in cases where one spouse had significantly wronged the other: infidelity, financial deception, abandonment. Judges respected him, opposing counsel feared him, and clients like me valued his ruthless efficiency. "Confirmation just came through," he said as he led me into his office. "Your husband and his companion departed the residence approximately 14 minutes ago. Our surveillance indicates they're headed toward Mount Hood as expected." I nodded, unsurprised. Rob was nothing if not predictable, a quality that had once been comforting, but had ultimately made this entire process almost too easy. "The locksmith is scheduled for 1 shearer," Marcus continued, consulting his tablet as we sat at his conference table. "Security team at 1:30, and I'll personally deliver the notices at 2 shearers." He glanced up. "You're certain you don't want to be present?" "Absolutely certain," I replied. "My presence would only create an opportunity for confrontation. Better to let the legal documents speak for themselves." Marcus nodded approvingly. He appreciated clients who understood strategy over emotion. "Now, let's review the documentation once more." He spread several folders across the table, each labeled with meticulous precision: property deed, financial evidence, infidelity documentation, abandonment of marital property. For the next hour, we methodically went through each folder, ensuring every document was properly prepared, every photograph dated and authenticated, every financial record verified. The case we were building wasn't just about reclaiming my house. It was about ensuring Rob couldn't contest any aspect of the divorce settlement I would eventually offer. "The judge assigned to your case is Harriet Lancaster," Marcus noted, making a small annotation on his legal pad. "She has little patience for infidelity and even less for financial deception. The evidence of Rob moving his girlfriend into the marital home so quickly after your disappearance, without filing any missing person report, will not go over well." "And the Morgan file?" I asked, referring to the discreet investigation we'd commissioned into Cascade Financial's troubles. Marcus slid another folder across the table. "Fresh this morning. The regulatory investigation is accelerating. 3 senior advisors have already received warning letters. Rob isn't among them yet, but his division is under particular scrutiny." I scanned the report, noting the projected timeline for potential sanctions, the specific transactions being investigated, the clients who had already withdrawn their investments. Rob's professional world was collapsing around him, and he had no idea I knew. "How much time does he have before this becomes public?" I asked. 2 weeks, 3 at most," Marcus replied. "When it breaks, the firm's reputation will be severely damaged. Any investments tied to their managed funds will be essentially worthless." I closed the folder, a new piece slotting into my understanding of Rob's recent behavior. "That explains the sudden liquidation of our joint investments last month. He's trying to get ahead of the crash." "Moving assets before a divorce filing is problematic enough," Marcus said. "Moving them while aware of pending regulatory action is considerably worse. Our forensic accountant has tracked 3 separate transfers to alternative investments in the past 6 weeks. Can we prove Rob knew about the investigation before making those transfers?" Marcus's smile was small but satisfied. His personal email to Natalie from February 9th, and I quote, "The regulators are looking into Peterson's accounts. Need to reposition quickly before this blows up." I raised an eyebrow. "You have access to his personal emails?" Let's just say Natalie's cloud storage security is significantly less robust than it should be for someone with access to potentially sensitive financial information. Marcus replied, with professional detachment. Also, she really should know better than to use her work computer for personal communications. By noon, we had finalized all preparations. The locksmith and security team were confirmed, the legal notices prepared and notarized, and a detailed inventory of all items in the house updated one final time. What happens when they return on Sunday and find themselves locked out? I asked, though I already knew the answer. They'll call you, obviously, Marcus replied. When that fails, they'll likely call a locksmith themselves, at which point they'll discover the new security system and the legal notices. The notices clearly state that any attempt to enter the property without your express permission will constitute trespassing. Given that the deed is solely in your name and Rob has been documented moving another woman into the property, his legal standing is extremely shaky. He'll be furious, I noted without particular concern. Undoubtedly. But fury doesn't change legal reality. Marcus gathered the folders, returning them to his secure cabinet. We've arranged for a security detail to monitor the property Sunday evening through Monday morning, just in case he decides to test the boundaries. As our meeting concluded, my phone buzzed with a text from the surveillance team. Subjects arrived at cabin 12:03 p.m., all clear at primary residence. Everything's on schedule, I informed Marcus. They've reached the cabin. He nodded, walking me to his office door. I'll call you when everything's completed this afternoon. In the meantime, I suggest you proceed with your day as planned. Best to establish normal patterns of behavior. My normal pattern for today included a scheduled lunch with the hospital board chairman, followed by a meeting with the architects for our new outpatient facility. Everyone at work believed I was in the midst of a trial separation, a simplified version of the truth that explained my temporary change of address without inviting unwanted questions or pity. As I left Marcus's building, I felt strangely light, as though I'd set down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for years. In many ways, I had. The weight of Rob's deception, my silent knowledge of his betrayal, the careful maintenance of our facade of marital harmony, all of it was finally being shed, replaced by the clean, clear lines of legal procedure and financial disentanglement. My phone buzzed again as I reached my car, this time with a message from Grace. Lunch still on for 1:30? Have updates on RF's workplace situation. I texted back a quick confirmation. Grace's position as the hospital's legal counsel gave her access to information networks that complemented my own. Her updates were always valuable. The restaurant Grace had chosen was deliberately casual, a farm-to-table cafe tucked between a bookstore and an artisanal bakery in Portland's Pearl District. Not the kind of place Rob or any of his colleagues would frequent, which made it perfect for our purposes. Grace was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, her typical corporate attire exchanged for weekend casual, though even her casual maintained an elegance that spoke of careful curation. You look suspiciously serene for someone in the middle of dismantling her marriage, she observed as I sat down. I prefer to think of it as reorganizing my life, I replied, accepting the menu from our server. Once we'd ordered, Grace leaned forward, her voice lowered. So Richards, my contact in the regulatory division, called this morning. The Cascade Financial investigation has expanded. They're looking at potential compliance violations now. I set down my water glass carefully. Compliance violations? That's more serious than we thought. Apparently, some of the senior advisors were misrepresenting investment performance data for certain high-value clients. The house of cards is collapsing spectacularly. Grace's expression was grim. Rob's division was handling some of these special accounts. Even if he wasn't directly involved in creating the misrepresentations, he had to have known something wasn't right. This complicated matters, potentially for the better from my perspective. If Rob faced professional sanctions, his ability to contest our divorce or make claims on my assets would be severely compromised. Timeline? I asked. Formal review concludes next week. Sanctions likely within the month. Our food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As we ate, I considered the implications of this new information. Rob was not just facing a divorce and the loss of his home. He was potentially looking at professional disgrace and financial ruin. A normal person might feel some sympathy, some residual concern for a man they'd spent 11 years married to. I searched my heart and found none. Rob had made his choices, professional and personal, with a cavalier disregard for consequences. Now those consequences were arriving, and I felt no obligation to shield him from them. "Any word about Natalie's involvement?" I asked, spearing a forkful of roasted beet salad. Grace shook her head. "As far as we know, she's just the executive assistant who became the girlfriend. No indication she's involved in the financial issues." She hesitated. Although what? Richards mentioned something interesting. Apparently, Natalie was previously employed at Meridian Wealth, another firm that came under regulatory investigation 2 years ago. She left just before the scandal broke. I filed this information away for future reference. Whether Natalie was merely attracted to powerful, corrupt men or actually involved in their schemes was unclear. Either way, she'd hitched her wagon to the wrong horse this time. "What time is the locksmith arriving?" Grace asked, changing the subject. 1 o'clock. Everything should be completed by 4. Grace studied me over her iced tea. "And you're really just going to let them return to a locked house with no warning? No conversation?" "What conversation would you suggest?" I countered. "Hello, Rob. Just wanted to let you know that the house you moved your girlfriend into is actually mine, and I'd like you both to leave immediately." "When you put it that way," Grace conceded with a small smile. "Besides," I continued, "this approach sends a clearer message. Rob needs to understand that I've been 3 steps ahead of him this entire time, that every move he thought was so clever was anticipated and countered before he even made it." "Remind me never to cross you," Grace said, only half joking. After lunch, I drove to my temporary apartment to prepare for the afternoon's operations. At precisely 1:05 p.m., I received confirmation that the locksmith had arrived at the house. At 1:27, the first photos appeared on my secure server, close-ups of the new deadbolts being installed, the old keys rendered useless. By 1:45, the security team had arrived and begun installation of the new system, one that required both a code and biometric confirmation for entry. My fingerprints were already programmed as the only authorized access point. At 2:12, Marcus texted, "Notices posted on all entries. Copies sent electronically to RB's email and delivered physically to his office. Security confirms installation complete. Property secured." I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was done. My house was reclaimed, legally and physically. Now came the waiting game. To occupy myself during this interlude, I focused on practical matters, reviewing the hospital's quarterly, projections, preparing notes for Monday's budget meeting, answering work emails that had accumulated over the past few days. I deliberately avoided checking the surveillance feeds from the house or Rob's location. There was nothing more to see until Sunday evening. That night, I treated myself to a rare indulgence, ordering in from my favorite Thai restaurant, opening a bottle of exceptional Oregon Pinot Noir I'd been saving, and watching a film I'd been wanting to see. Small celebrations for small victories. The true confrontation was still to come. Sunday arrived with unexpected serenity. I spent the morning at a hot yoga class, followed by brunch with a former colleague who knew nothing of my marital situation. The normality was refreshing, a reminder that life continued beyond the drama currently unfolding in my personal sphere. By late afternoon, however, my focus had shifted back to the impending confrontation. According to the tracking data, Rob and Natalie had left the cabin at 3:05 p.m. Their typical drive time would put them back at the house between 5 and 5:30 p.m. At 4:45, I received confirmation that the security team was in position, unmarked. Cars at strategic points with clear views of all entrances to the property. Their instructions were clear: observe and document, but intervene only if there was an attempt to forcibly enter the house or if the situation escalated to potential violence. At 5:22, the notification I'd been waiting for. Subject's vehicle. Approaching neighborhood. ETA at property approximately 3 minutes. I settled into the chair in my home office, iPad propped on the desk, displaying the feeds from the security cameras now positioned around my house. Split screens showed the driveway, front entrance, back door, and side gate. Everything was quiet, peaceful. For now. At 5:26, Rob's Audi turned into the driveway. I watched as he and Natalie emerged from the car, laughing about something, completely unaware of what awaited them. They unloaded their weekend bags from the trunk, and Rob led the way to the front door. The first hint of trouble came when his key failed to turn in the lock. I observed his confusion, the repeated attempts, the growing frustration. Natalie said something, gesturing at the door. Rob tried again, more forcefully this time. Finally, he stepped back, running a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. Natalie pointed to something, the legal notice prominently affixed to the door. Rob ripped it off, holding it closer to read in the fading evening light. Even without audio, I could track the progression of his reaction, confusion giving way to disbelief, then anger. He crumpled the notice, threw it to the ground, then pulled out his phone. On cue, my phone began to ring, Rob's name and photo appearing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. On the security feed, I watched him leave a message, his body language, conveying his growing rage. Natalie was on her phone too, perhaps calling a locksmith or researching what to do when locked out of your home. The expected text arrived moments later. "What the hell is going on? Why are the locks changed? Call me immediately." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that the legal notices hadn't already communicated. Rob's next move was predictable. He stormed around to the back door, Natalie trailing behind, only to find it similarly secured with a matching legal notice. His body language conveyed his escalating rage, the tight shoulders, the clenched fists, the aggressive stance. When he returned to the front yard, he was already on his phone again, likely calling a locksmith. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. The security system we'd installed was registered with all local locksmith services. Any legitimate business would refuse the job once they ran the address through their system and saw the legal hold. Sure enough, Rob's expression confirmed my prediction. Whoever he was speaking to had clearly declined his request. He ended the call with visible anger, then immediately dialed again. Same result, judging by his reaction. Natalie appeared to be growing uncomfortable, hugging herself as the evening air cooled. She said something to Rob, who snapped back at her before returning to his futile attempts to contact me. By the 10th call, all sent straight to voicemail, Rob had progressed to pounding on the front door and shouting. The security team texted an update. Subject becoming volatile. Neighbors taking notice. Security prepared to intervene if necessary. I texted back, hold positions unless property damage occurs or physical threats made. Just as I sent this instruction, Rob appeared to have a new idea. He returned to his car, rummaged through the trunk, and emerged with what looked like a tire iron. My heart rate increased slightly. Was he actually going to try to break in? Before he could approach the house, however, a police cruiser turned onto the street, slowing as it neared my property. One of the neighbors must have called in a disturbance. Perfect. The officers approached Rob, who was still holding the tire iron. A brief conversation ensued, during which I could see Rob gesturing wildly at the house, likely claiming it was his home, that he was locked out. One officer examined the legal notice while the other spoke into his radio, presumably running the address to check property records. The encounter ended exactly as I anticipated. The officers clearly informed Rob that the property was registered, solely in my name, that the legal notices were valid, and that any attempt to enter without permission would constitute criminal trespassing. They instructed him to remove his vehicle from the driveway and leave the premises. Rob's fury was evident even on the small screen. The red face, the aggressive posturing, the finger-pointing. But against uniformed officers with clear property records, his rage was impotent. Eventually, he stormed back to his car, Natalie hurrying behind him with their weekend bags. As they drove away, I received a final text from the security team. Subjects departing area. Officers remaining to file incident report. All documented. I set down my phone and leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, slow breath. Phase 1 complete. My phone buzzed again. Marcus this time. Police report being filed. Officers. Confirmed legal notices properly served. Security staying in position overnight as planned. Well executed, Emma. The last sentence brought an unexpected sense of satisfaction. Yes, it had been well executed. From the meticulous documentation of Rob's infidelity to the strategic timing of my disappearance. From the careful monitoring of his financial maneuvers to today's reclamation of my property. Every step calculated, every reaction anticipated. I knew what came next. Rob would regroup, consult attorneys, and attempt to mount a counteroffensive. He would discover that his options were severely limited by the property deed, the evidence of infidelity, the documented financial deceptions, and now the police report regarding his attempt to enter my house with a potential weapon. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully, knowing that Rob and Natalie were scrambling to find accommodations, their romantic weekend shattered, their sense of security demolished. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Rob, his final attempt of, "The evening. You won't get away with this. You have no idea what you're up against. This is my house too." I smiled faintly at his predictable bluster. How little he knew. How little he had ever known about me, about my capabilities, about the careful groundwork I'd been laying for years. I typed back a single reply, the only communication I would offer him until our lawyers met formally. "Check the property deed, Rob. You never owned a thing." Then I turned off my phone, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled in for a quiet evening alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new strategies to implement. But tonight, I savored this small victory, the first public move in a game that had been silently unfolding for months. Rob had always underestimated me. By the time this was over, he would never make that mistake again. Morning arrived with the expected deluge. 17 missed calls from Rob, 34 text messages, ranging from threats to pleas to accusations, 4 voicemails that progressively declined in coherence and increased in volume. More importantly, there were updates from Marcus. Rob had contacted 4 separate law firms overnight. 2 had declined to represent him after preliminary research into the property records. The third, Westbrook and Associates, known for aggressive litigation regardless of case merit, had scheduled a consultation for 9 a.m. I forwarded this information to Grace, who responded immediately. W&A has conflicts with 3 hospital board members. 1 call from me and they'll drop him faster than yesterday's sushi. I considered this option briefly before declining. Let him waste his money on futile consultations, more evidence of poor judgment. My office voicemail included an angry message from Rob demanding I call him immediately to sort out this misunderstanding. His corporate email, which I still had access to through backdoor channels set up months ago, showed frantic messages to colleagues seeking recommendations for real estate attorneys and temporary housing options. Most telling was an exchange with his direct supervisor. "Need emergency personal leave today. Family situation requires immediate attention." The response was not what Rob had likely hoped for. Request noted. Be advised the Compliance Committee is meeting at 10 a.m. regarding division audit findings. Your presence is mandatory. Rob's world was collapsing on multiple fronts simultaneously, exactly as I had planned. By the end of today, he would be facing not just the loss of his home and marriage, but potentially his career and financial stability as well. I dressed with particular care for my own day, selecting a navy power suit that projected confidence and control. Today I would attend the hospital executive committee meeting where our new outpatient center would be approved, a professional triumph that would secure my position for years to come. As I applied my makeup, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Rob had always defined our success as a couple through his achievements, his career advances, his investment wins, his social connections. He had never fully appreciated that. My quiet competence, my strategic planning, my financial acumen were the true foundation of everything we had built. Now he would learn that lesson the hard way, as everything he thought was his crumbled beneath him, and everything that was truly mine remained rock solid. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Court filing prepared. Ready to proceed on your command. When would you like to serve him? I considered the timeline carefully before responding. Wait until after the Cascade Financial announcement. Maximum impact. Marcus's reply was immediate and appreciative. Strategically sound. Will prepare accordingly. I slipped my phone into my purse and headed out, ready to face the day, ready to move forward with the next phase of my carefully orchestrated plan. Rob thought yesterday's locked door was the battle. He had no idea it was merely the opening, move in a much larger war, one he had already lost before it even began. The hospital executive committee meeting proceeded exactly as I'd anticipated. Unanimous approval for the outpatient facility I'd spent 14 months developing. As chief administrative officer, I'd crafted a financing structure that protected the hospital's assets while maximizing service delivery. The CEO's congratulatory handshake and the admiring nods from my fellow executives provided a moment of professional satisfaction that contrasted sharply with the personal chaos I was methodically navigating. Outstanding work, Emma, Dr. Morrison, the CEO, said as we exited the conference room. The precision of your financial projections continues to impress us all. Thank you, I replied with a modest smile. It's simply a matter of anticipating variables and planning accordingly. If only he knew how broadly that philosophy extended beyond my professional life. Back in my office, I found 3 more missed calls from Rob and a text from Marcus. Westbrook and Associates declined representation after consultation. RB now attempting to secure Dalton Legal Services. Dalton Legal, a mid-tier firm known for taking cases others rejected. Their reputation was built on aggressive tactics rather than legal brilliance. They'd be expensive and ultimately ineffective, but they might create temporary complications. I forwarded this information to Grace, who responded almost immediately. Dalton represents 2 donors currently negotiating major gifts to our new cancer center. Potential conflict. Want me to make a call? Again, I declined the assistance. Let him proceed. More financial damage, more desperate decisions. My professional mask remained firmly in place as I conducted afternoon meetings, reviewed departmental budgets, and finalized quarterly projections. No one at the hospital would have guessed that I was simultaneously orchestrating the systematic dismantling of my marriage and my husband's carefully constructed facade. At 3:26 p.m., a breaking news alert flashed across my computer screen. Regulatory. Authorities issue formal reprimand to Cascade Financial Partners. Attached was footage of somber-looking officials entering the gleaming downtown headquarters where Rob had built his career. My phone buzzed immediately with a text from Grace. Happening now. 6 senior advisors called in for questioning. Richards says sanctions coming tomorrow. Rob's division specifically mentioned in findings. I allowed myself exactly 5 seconds to process this development before responding. Time to accelerate our timeline. Contact Marcus. Events were unfolding faster than even I had projected. The regulatory investigation had moved from quiet inquiry to public action, And Rob was now caught in a perfect storm. Personal betrayal exposed, professional misconduct under investigation, legal options dwindling, financial resources under scrutiny. I sent a brief message to Marcus. Move forward with divorce filing tomorrow morning. Maximum media coverage. His response was equally concise. Documents prepared. 9 a.m. filing for maximum news cycle impact. Coordination with financial press arranged. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Rob would be dealing with the fallout from the regulatory action while simultaneously being served with divorce papers outlining his infidelity, financial misconduct, and false claims to property ownership, all while scrambling for new accommodations and legal representation. As the workday ended, I maintained my usual routine, reviewing final emails, organizing my desk for tomorrow, exchanging pleasantries with colleagues as I departed. No one would see anything unusual in my demeanor or schedule. Maintaining normal patterns was crucial to controlling the narrative that would inevitably emerge once news of my divorce filing became public. In my car, I checked the tracking app one final time. Rob's location showed him still at Cascade Financial's offices, presumably being questioned by regulatory investigators or desperately trying to salvage client relationships. Either way, he was occupying exactly the position I needed him in: distracted, defensive, and diminished. Instead of returning to my temporary apartment, I directed my car toward a different destination: the house, my house. For the first time since implementing my plan, I would return to reclaim the space that had been temporarily invaded by Rob and his girlfriend. The security team had been notified of my arrival, and they verified my identity as I approached. The new locks responded to my key, the new security system to my biometric data. Stepping across the threshold felt like reclaiming territory. Not just physical space, but the psychological ground that Rob had attempted to colonize with his betrayal. Inside, the house looked much as I had left it 4 weeks ago, with subtle differences that spoke volumes about the brief occupation. Natalie's designer handbag hung on the entryway hook. A different brand of coffee sat on the kitchen counter. 2 wine glasses remained in the sink from their pre-weekend departure. I moved methodically through the rooms, noting each intrusion, each alteration. In the master bedroom, Natalie's clothes hung alongside mine in the closet, her designer dresses nudging against my tailored suits as if they belonged there. Her cosmetics cluttered the bathroom vanity I had always kept meticulously organized. Most telling was the nightstand on what had been Rob's side of the bed. A woman's novel, a pair of reading glasses that weren't mine, a different brand of hand cream than I used. Natalie hadn't just visited. She had begun establishing permanence, claiming space, settling in. The guest bedroom had been converted to a makeshift office for Rob. His laptop docking station, dual monitors, and stacks of financial reports arranged with the precision he always insisted on for his workspace. A bottle of his preferred scotch sat half empty on the antique side table that had been my grandmother's. I took photographs of everything, additional evidence for the divorce proceedings, should it become necessary. Then I began the process of reclamation. Natalie's clothes were removed from the closet, folded neatly, and placed in the designer luggage she had left in the corner of the room. Her toiletries were gathered from the bathroom, wrapped in tissue paper, and added to the suitcase. Every trace of her presence was methodically erased, not with anger, but with the same clinical efficiency I brought to hospital budget reviews. Rob's personal items received similar treatment. Business clothes segregated from casual wear, shoes paired and placed in their original boxes, cufflinks and watches secured in their cases. His files were organized chronologically, electronic equipment disconnected and packed properly. Even his scotch was recorked and added to the collection. By the time I finished, 8 perfectly packed suitcases and storage containers lined the everything Rob and Natalie had brought into my house ready for their removal. Nothing damaged, nothing destroyed, nothing missing. I had erased their presence without diminishing any possessions they could claim as their own. The final touch was a printed notice placed atop the luggage. Personal items ready for retrieval. Contact Thompson and Rivera to arrange supervised collection. Any attempt to enter property without prior arrangement will be considered trespassing and prosecuted accordingly. As I completed this task, my phone buzzed with another news alert. Cascade Financial under formal investigation. Regulators cite significant concerns about client account management. Accompanying the headline was a stock photo of the firm's executive team from last year's annual report. Rob stood at the edge of the group, smiling confidently in his bespoke suit, unaware that the image would now be used to illustrate his firm's downfall. I forwarded the alert to Marcus with a simple question. Impact on timeline? His response was immediate. Proceeding as planned. 9 Iwindao AM filing. Media already monitoring courthouse for financial regulatory developments. Our filing will provide additional context they'll eagerly report. Perfect. The business press would be primed to connect Rob's professional misconduct with his personal failures. The narrative would write itself. Senior investment advisor under regulatory investigation, also accused of marital infidelity and attempted property theft. His credibility would be destroyed on all fronts simultaneously. I spent that night in my reclaimed home, sleeping in freshly made beds with new linens I'd brought with me. The security team remained stationed outside, ensuring no unexpected visits disturbed my first night back in my own space. Morning arrived with a flurry of activity. At 8:45 a.m., Marcus texted, "En route to courthouse. Filing prepared with expedited processing request." At 9:12 a.m., filing complete. Court has assigned case number. Initial hearing date request submitted for earliest available slot. At 9:37 a.m., process server en route to Cascade Financial. Offices with divorce papers. Media alerted to significant development in ongoing regulatory investigation. I monitored these developments from my hospital office, maintaining my normal Monday schedule of department head meetings and financial reviews. To all outward appearances, I was simply the efficient, focused CAO everyone had come to rely on. No one would connect me to the breaking news story until I chose to reveal that connection. At 11:17 a.m., the text I'd been waiting for arrived from Marcus. Paper served. RB received documents in front of colleagues and regulatory investigators. Maximum impact achieved. I could picture the scene perfectly. Rob being handed legal documents while already under scrutiny from regulatory authorities. His professional mask cracking as he realized the papers outlined not just divorce proceedings, but detailed allegations of infidelity, financial misconduct, and false property claims. His colleagues watching his composure shatter. The investigators noting his emotional response for future reference. By noon, the story had broken across multiple financial news outlets. Cascade Financial Advisor served with divorce papers amid regulatory investigation. One particularly thorough reporter had already connected the dots. Court records show investment director's wife owns property he claimed as marital asset. Rob's professional and personal collapse was now public knowledge. His humiliation complete and documented, just as I had planned. My phone began ringing incessantly. Calls from Rob, from unknown numbers, likely reporters, from mutual acquaintances curious about the breaking story. I declined them all, maintaining my focus on hospital business as if nothing unusual was occurring. Grace appeared in my office doorway just after my last scheduled meeting, closing the door behind her. "It's everywhere," she said without preamble. "Every financial news outlet, local stations, even some national coverage because of the regulatory angle. Rob's face is all over the business channels." I nodded, unsurprised. "Has he attempted to contact you?" 3 calls in the past hour, Grace confirmed. I didn't answer. Hospital counsel has no comment on the personal matters of employees' spouses. "And the board?" "Morrison called an emergency executive session for 3 p.m. They'll want reassurance that this won't impact hospital operations or the outpatient facility." I glanced at my watch. "I'll prepare a statement addressing potential concerns." Grace studied me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're remarkably calm for someone whose divorce has just become breaking news. This is merely the implementation phase of a plan that's been in development for months," I replied. "Everything is proceeding as anticipated." The hospital board meeting was brief and focused. I presented a concise overview of my personal situation, emphasizing that my financial holdings were entirely separate from Rob's, that the house and all major assets were solely in my name, and that the divorce proceedings would not impact my professional responsibilities or the hospital's financial projects. "The timing of these revelations is unfortunate, but ultimately beneficial," I concluded. "With everything now in the open, there will be no lingering questions or concerns that might distract from our work going forward." Dr. Morrison voiced the board's unanimous support, noting that my characteristic foresight in keeping my financial affairs separate from Rob's demonstrated the same prudence I brought to managing the hospital's resources. By the time I left the hospital that evening, 3 significant developments had occurred. First, Cascade Financial had announced the immediate suspension of 4 advisors, including Rob. Second, the regulatory authorities had filed formal sanctions against the firm for misrepresentation of investment performance and breach of fiduciary duty. And third, Rob had been photographed by news crews leaving the firm's offices with a cardboard box of personal items, the universal symbol of unceremonious termination. As I drove home, my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered through the car's Bluetooth system. "Emma," Natalie's voice, unexpectedly steady despite the circumstances. "We need to talk." "I believe my attorney has provided instructions for retrieving your personal items," I replied, maintaining the same professional tone I would use with a difficult vendor. "This isn't about clothes or toiletries," she said, an edge creeping into her voice. "This is about Rob, about what you're doing to him." I allowed a moment of silence before responding. "What I'm doing to him? Interesting perspective." "He's being destroyed professionally because of your timing," Natalie continued. "You could have filed for divorce any time. You deliberately coordinated with the regulatory investigation to maximize damage." "An intriguing theory," I conceded, slowing for a red light, "though it presumes I have influence over financial regulatory authorities." "Don't play innocent," Natalie snapped. "I've worked in financial firms long enough to recognize a coordinated attack. You've been planning this for months." "And you've been sleeping with my husband for months," I countered, my voice remaining calm. "Perhaps longer. Your professional insights should have warned you about the risks of associating with someone like Rob, personally and professionally." A pause, then, "What do you want? Money? Some sort of revenge? What would it take to end this scorched earth campaign?" The light turned green, and I accelerated smoothly. "I already have what I want, Natalie. My house, my assets, my reputation, intact. Rob's actions, professional and personal, have consequences. He's experiencing them now, as are you by association. You cold, calculating, methodical," I corrected her. "Strategic, forward-thinking. The qualities Rob once claimed to value in me before he decided a younger, more compliant companion would better serve his ego." Another pause, longer this time. When Natalie spoke again, her voice had changed, less confrontational, more calculating. "What if I have information? Things Rob told me about your finances, about the hospital's dealings, things that might interest certain investigators." Ah, there it was, the threat beneath the anger. I smiled slightly, though she couldn't see it. "That would be ill-advised for 2 reasons," I replied. "First, any financial insights Rob shared with you were likely fabrications, designed to impress you with his non-existent acumen. And second, false allegations to regulatory agencies are themselves prosecutable offenses. as I'm sure you're aware from your extensive experience in financial firms. I could almost hear her recalculating, trying to find leverage that didn't exist. Retrieval of your personal items can be arranged for tomorrow between 2 and 4 p.m., I continued. A representative from Thompson and Rivera will be present to supervise and document the process. If that time frame doesn't work for you, alternative arrangements can be discussed with my attorney. Good evening, Natalie. I ended the call before she could respond, satisfied that another potential complication had been neutralized. Natalie might be angry, but she was also strategic enough to recognize a losing position when she found herself in one. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Grace's car already parked by the curb. She was waiting on the front steps, holding a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression that mixed concern with celebration. "I thought you might need company tonight," she explained as I approached. "The news coverage is intensifying. They've connected the divorce filing to the regulatory investigation, and they're digging into Rob's background, previous relationships, everything." I unlocked the door, disarming the security system with my fingerprint. "Was that your doing?" Grace shook her head as we entered. "This is pure journalistic feeding frenzy. Financial scandal plus personal betrayal equals ratings gold. They're running with it without any encouragement needed." In the kitchen, I gathered glasses while Grace opened the champagne. The quiet domesticity of the moment contrasted sharply with the public storm surrounding Rob's downfall. "Have you seen the footage?" Grace asked, pouring the champagne. "Rob being escorted from the building? It's all over the business channels." I shook my head. "I've been focused on hospital matters." Grace pulled out her tablet and navigated to a news site. The video played automatically. Rob emerged from the Cascade Financial building, jacket collar turned up against the cameras, ignoring reporters' shouted questions as he hurried toward a waiting taxi. His face was ashen, his normally perfect appearance disheveled. The cardboard box in his arms contained framed photos, a trophy from some investment competition, and what appeared to be his prized limited edition fountain pen collection. "They're saying he's facing potential sanctions," Grace commented, accepting the glass I offered. "Professional censure, possibly even license revocation if they can prove he knew about the larger firm issues." "And his attorney prospects?" "Dwindling by the hour. 4 more firms have declined to represent him since this morning. Apparently, no one wants to be associated with what they're calling the Cascade calamity." I raised my glass in a small toast. "To consequences." Grace clinked her glass against mine. "To meticulous planning." We settled in the living room, the house now fully reclaimed as my own space. Rob and Natalie's personal items were neatly packed and waiting in the foyer, a visual representation of their ejection from my life. "Natalie called me on my way home," I mentioned casually. "She attempted to threaten me with supposed financial information Rob shared with her." Grace sat up straighter. "That's concerning. What specifically?" "Nothing substantive," I assured her. "A desperate attempt to gain leverage." I reminded her that fabricating allegations to regulatory agencies carries its own legal risks. "Still," Grace said, her legal mind already assessing potential threats, "we should document the call. It could constitute attempted extortion, depending on the precise wording she used." I nodded in agreement. "I'll have the car's call recording. System download the audio file. Marcus should have it for his records." As the evening progressed, we discussed next steps. The initial divorce hearing scheduled for the following week, the media strategy for addressing inevitable questions, the security measures still in place to prevent any unauthorized visits from Rob. Around 8 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You have no idea what's coming." I showed the message to Grace, who immediately took a screenshot. "Documented threat. I'll forward it to Marcus and the security team." "He's desperate," I observed. "His professional reputation destroyed. His Personal life exposed, his financial resources dwindling. Desperation leads to mistakes, which is exactly what we anticipated. Grace nodded. Each reckless action or threat simply strengthens your position. By the time Grace left, we had refined the strategy for the coming days, maintaining my professional composure at the hospital, documenting any contact attempts from Rob or Natalie, proceeding methodically with the divorce filing while the Cascade Financial investigation unfolded in parallel. Alone in my reclaimed house, I conducted one final walkthrough before retiring for the night. Every room now restored to my preferred order, every intrusion removed, every space reclaimed. The physical manifestation of the larger reclamation taking place in my life. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a final update from Marcus. Court date confirmed for next Monday. Judge Lancaster assigned as anticipated. RB has secured representation from Dalton Legal Services, final firm willing to take his case, limited resources, questionable strategy. I responded with a simple acknowledgement, then set my phone aside. Everything continued to unfold according to plan. Rob scrambling to secure subpar legal representation. The divorce proceedings advancing on our preferred timeline. The media connecting all the unsavory elements of his professional and personal conduct. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new challenges to navigate. But tonight, I would sleep peacefully in my own bed, in my own home, secure in the knowledge that Rob's belated education about property deeds, financial independence, and the consequences of betrayal was proceeding exactly as designed. The next 2 weeks unfolded with the precision of a meticulously choreographed performance. Each day brought new developments in Rob's professional and personal collapse while I maintained my carefully crafted equilibrium. By Thursday morning, 7 days after the initial court filing, the Cascade Financial scandal had expanded beyond anyone's initial projections. 5 senior advisors had accepted settlement agreements with regulators in exchange for testimony against the others. The regulatory authorities had frozen all executive assets pending further investigation, and Rob's name appeared prominently in every article about the firm's questionable practices. They're calling it a classic case of performance misrepresentation with a modern twist, Grace explained during our weekly lunch at a quiet bistro tucked away from the main business district. Using client funds to cover unreported losses, falsifying returns, creating elaborate spreadsheets to hide the money trail. The state regulatory chief is comparing it to the Lincoln Trust debacle, just on a smaller scale. I sipped my sparkling water, absorbing this information with practiced composure. And Rob's specific involvement? According to the latest documents, he personally managed several of the problematic accounts. They have evidence showing he knew about the discrepancies for at least 15 months. Coincidentally, around the time he began his affair with Natalie. That timing wasn't coincidental, of course. Financial pressure and personal betrayal often moved in tandem, each feeding the other in a downward spiral of increasingly poor decisions. Speaking of Natalie, Grace continued, lowering her voice though we were seated in a private corner. Did you see this morning's business section? They've connected her to 3 different advisory firms that faced regulatory action. Always as an executive assistant to a director later charged with violations, always departing just before investigations became public. I hadn't seen the article, but the pattern aligned with my own research into Natalie's employment history. They're suggesting she was somehow involved in the schemes, Grace said, breaking off a piece of artisan bread. Nothing that direct yet, she clarified, but they're certainly implying she has a habit of forming relationships with executives engaged in questionable practices. Whether she's an accomplice or simply has terrible judgment in men remains unclear. The distinction wouldn't matter much for Natalie's future employment prospects. Association with multiple financial scandals effectively ended careers in the investment world, regardless of personal culpability. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. RB's attorney requesting settlement conference. Apparently regulatory. Counsel advised resolving divorce quickly to focus on professional defense. This development was earlier than anticipated, but not unwelcome. Rob's legal resources were stretched thin between the regulatory charges and divorce proceedings. Settling the latter would allow him to concentrate on the former, a practical decision his attorneys had likely been pushing for days. I responded, simply, "What terms are they proposing?" Marcus's reply came moments later. "None yet, floating the concept only. Shall I schedule preliminary discussion?" After brief consideration, I texted back, "Proceed, but maintain all current positions on property and assets." The strategic advantages of a settlement were considerable. A negotiated agreement would avoid protracted court battles, prevent any unexpected judicial rulings, and most importantly, provide a clean, definitive end to my connection with Rob. The regulatory proceedings against him might drag on for years, but our divorce could be finalized and behind me in a matter of weeks. "Good news?" Grace asked, noting my slight smile. "Potentially. Rob's counsel is requesting settlement discussions." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That was faster than we projected. His resources must be even more limited than we thought." "The regulatory case takes precedence," I noted. "His attorneys are likely advising him to simplify where possible." "And will you agree to settlement talks?" "Of course. A clean resolution benefits me as much as him, provided the terms reflect reality. Reality being that I owned the house, outright, that my financial assets were properly segregated from his, and that his infidelity and financial misconduct had been thoroughly documented. Any reasonable settlement would acknowledge these facts rather than contest them." As lunch concluded, I received another text from Marcus. "Meeting scheduled for tomorrow, 10 a.m. RB will not attend personally, counsel only." Perfect. Negotiating. With attorneys rather than Rob directly would keep emotions removed from the proceedings, allowing for more efficient resolution. The fact that Rob wouldn't be present suggested his lawyers had recognized his volatility as a liability in negotiations. The rest of the day proceeded according to my carefully maintained schedule. Hospital budget meetings, review of the outpatient, center construction timeline, routine administrative tasks that anchored my professional identity regardless of personal circumstances. By evening, another significant development had emerged. The business press had uncovered connections between specific misrepresented accounts at Cascade Financial and offshore entities linked to Rob personally. The implications were damning, not just professional misconduct within the firm, but potential personal enrichment through deliberately deceptive practices. Marcus called as I was reviewing these reports. "Have you seen the latest?" "Just reading it now," I confirmed. "This changes our settlement approach," he noted. "If these offshore accounts are verified, they would constitute hidden assets subject to discovery in divorce proceedings, unless we agree not to pursue them as part of a settlement. Which gives us additional leverage for tomorrow's discussion," I pointed out. Marcus paused, then chuckled softly. "And this is why you're my favorite client." "Yes, exactly. I suspect tomorrow's offer will be surprisingly generous given these new revelations. They'll want to avoid any additional financial scrutiny from our forensic accountants, which could potentially uncover evidence relevant to the regulatory case." The strategy was sound. By allowing Rob's counsel to establish initial terms, we would gain insight into what they were most concerned about protecting or concealing. That information itself had value beyond any specific dollar amount they might propose. The settlement conference the following morning validated this approach entirely. Rob's attorneys, now expanded to include a specialist in professional licensing defense, proposed terms that were indeed surprisingly favorable. They conceded full ownership of the house, which was already legally mine, acknowledged the separation of financial assets, and even offered a substantial cash settlement to expedite proceedings and provide closure for both parties. This last element was particularly telling. Rob had no legal obligation to provide additional funds beyond returning any marital assets. he might have appropriated. A voluntary cash settlement suggested strongly that his legal team feared what further financial investigation might uncover. Marcus received their proposal with professional neutrality, promising to review the terms with me and respond within 48 hours. As soon as we were alone in his office, however, his poker face gave way to a satisfied smile. "They're terrified of financial discovery," he observed, highlighting specific clauses in the settlement agreement. These waivers of further accounting, the expedited timeline, the non-disclosure provisions, all designed to prevent our forensic accountants from examining his finances further. I reviewed the document carefully, noting the generous terms alongside the restrictive clauses. The cash settlement is significantly higher than we anticipated. "Blood money," Marcus said bluntly. "They're hoping you'll take it and walk away without asking questions about where it came from or what else might be hidden. And if we countered by demanding full financial disclosure instead of accepting the settlement." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. "It would delay the divorce proceedings, potentially by months. Any information we uncovered would likely be shared with regulators through discovery requirements. Rob's professional exposure would increase significantly." I weighed these options carefully. The settlement offered immediate closure and substantial financial compensation. Further investigation promised potential satisfaction in seeing Rob face additional consequences, but at the cost of prolonging my own connection to him and his misdeeds. "Draft a counteroffer," I decided. "Accept the general framework, but increase the settlement amount by 30%. Add provisions for retrieval of any remaining personal items from the house, and include strict non-contact requirements going forward." Marcus nodded approvingly. "They'll accept. The additional amount is significant but not prohibitive, and the non-contact provisions benefit Rob as much as you at this point." He was right. By that evening, Rob's counsel had agreed to our counteroffer with minimal negotiation. The final settlement included the increased financial compensation, comprehensive non-contact provisions, and an expedited timeline for finalizing all documentation. The divorce would be complete within 10 days, assuming the judge approved the settlement terms, which Marcus assured me was virtually certain given the circumstances and Judge Lancaster's previous rulings. As I left Marcus's office that evening, a notification appeared on my phone, a news alert with Rob's name in the headline, "Cascade Financial Advisor released on $50,000 bond after regulatory hearing. Professional license suspended." The attached article included a courthouse photograph of Rob leaving his hearing. The transformation was shocking, even to me. In just 2 weeks, he had aged a decade. The polished, confident investment advisor had been replaced by a haggard, defeated figure in an ill-fitting suit. Photographers captured him shielding his face from cameras, shoulders hunched, escorted by grim-faced attorneys on either side. Most telling was the complete absence of Natalie in any recent coverage. According to Grace's sources, she had left Portland 3 days ago, her destination unknown. Whether she had abandoned Rob to his fate or been advised to distance herself from the case remained unclear. Either way, his personal and professional support systems had evaporated simultaneously. The following week passed in a blur of paperwork, signatures, and final arrangements. The divorce settlement was submitted to the court, reviewed by Judge Lancaster, and approved with remarkable efficiency. Rob's attorneys pushed for immediate processing, likely under instruction to resolve the divorce before additional regulatory charges might complicate matters further. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Marcus called with the news I had been waiting for. "It's done. The judge signed the final decree this morning. You are officially divorced." The words landed with surprising gentleness, not the dramatic climax one might expect after months of strategic planning, but rather the quiet conclusion of a necessary business transaction. "Thank you," I said simply, "for everything." "My pleasure," Marcus replied, professional but warm. "The final settlement has been transferred to your account. The deed to the house has been re-registered with additional notations confirming sole ownership. All legal notifications have been sent to relevant parties, and the non-contact provisions are in full effect immediately. Any attempt by Rob to contact you directly would constitute violation of a court order, potentially resulting in additional legal consequences. Another loose end neatly tied. Rob would not be appearing on my doorstep or calling my phone in desperate attempts to negotiate or manipulate. The legal barriers were now as firm as the emotional ones I had constructed months ago. That evening, Grace arrived at my house with an expensive bottle of Pinot Noir and a small, elegantly wrapped package. To commemorate the occasion, she explained as I welcomed her inside. We settled in the living room, now redecorated to my personal preferences rather than the compromise style that had characterized my marriage to Rob. The new furnishings, artwork, and color scheme reflected my aesthetic completely. No concessions, no accommodations for anyone else's taste. Grace raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, clean breaks, and bulletproof property deeds. I smiled, clinking my glass against hers. And to thorough preparation. Open your gift, she urged after we had each sipped the excellent wine. The small package contained a beautiful silver paperweight, elegantly engraved with a single word, vindicated. It seemed fitting, Grace explained. Not just surviving, but vindicated, having your judgment, decisions, and ownership affirmed. I turned the paperweight in my hand, appreciating both the sentiment and the craftsmanship. It's perfect, thank you. As we enjoyed the wine, Grace updated me on the latest developments in Rob's case. 6 more advisors had accepted regulatory settlements, each implicating him in increasingly serious violations. His bond conditions had been tightened after regulators expressed concern about his travel to Seattle the previous weekend, and the offshore accounts connected to him were now under scrutiny by federal financial crime units. They're projecting a minimum 2-year license suspension if he's found liable on all counts, Grace noted. Possibly permanent revocation depending on what the offshore investigation uncovers. I absorbed this information with the same cool detachment I'd maintained. Throughout the process, Rob's fate was no longer connected to mine in any way. His choices had led him to this point, just as my choices had led me to mine. And professionally? Grace asked, changing the subject. The hospital board remained supportive. More than supportive, I confirmed. The outpatient center is proceeding ahead of schedule. My quarterly performance review was exemplary, and Dr. Morrison has hinted at potential advancement opportunities in the coming year. My professional success continued uninterrupted, perhaps even enhanced by the contrast between my composed handling of personal challenges and Rob's spectacular implosion. Where his career lay in ruins, mine continued its steady upward trajectory, built on the solid foundation of competence rather than deception. After Grace departed, I moved through my reclaimed home with a sense of peaceful completion. Each room now reflected only my preferences, my choices, my vision. No traces of Rob. Remained, all his belongings had been removed, all evidence of his temporary occupation erased. In my home office, I opened the secure file I had maintained throughout this process, a detailed documentation of Rob's betrayal, my strategic response, and the ultimate resolution. The final entry would be made tonight, closing this chapter, permanently. As I typed the concluding notes, a news alert appeared on my computer screen. Federal authorities join Cascade Financial investigation. New evidence suggests broader pattern of misconduct. Rob's world continued to collapse, the consequences of his actions multiplying beyond even my careful projections. But that story was no longer connected to mine. I had extricated myself completely, protecting what was mine while allowing him to face the natural repercussions of his choices. I completed my final entry, saved the file, and closed the document. Then I activated the secure deletion protocol we had established months ago, systematically removing all traces of my documentation from any potentially discoverable source. The record of my strategy existed now only in encrypted backups, accessible solely to me. Insurance against any future attempts to rewrite this history. 1 year later, I stood at the window of my executive office on the top floor of the hospital's new wing. The outpatient center I had spearheaded was now completed ahead of schedule and under budget. My promotion to Chief Operations Officer had been announced the previous month, culminating years of strategic career advancement. The morning's business news had included a small item about Rob's settlement with regulatory authorities, a lifetime ban from the financial industry, forfeiture of professional credentials, and restitution payments that would extend well beyond the 5-year probation period he had been assigned. Natalie had reportedly relocated to Arizona, working now as an administrative assistant at a local community college, a significant step down from her previous executive positions, but perhaps the only option available given her association with multiple financial scandals. I felt no satisfaction in this news, no vindictive pleasure in their downfall. Those emotions had burned away long ago, replaced by the cool clarity that had guided me through each phase of my response to Rob's betrayal. What remained was simply recognition of natural consequences. His actions had produced precisely the results that should have been expected. My assistant knocked lightly on the open door. "Your 10 hours here, Ms. Bennett, the architectural team for the new pediatric center." "Thank you, Jennifer. I'll be right there." I gathered my presentation materials and took one last look at the view from my window. The city spread out below, opportunities extending in every direction. My house remained my sanctuary, my career continued its ascent, and my life proceeded on the path I had carefully constructed. Rob had moved his girlfriend into my house, never bothering to read the deed that would have revealed his vulnerability. That single act of carelessness, born of arrogance, entitlement, and underestimation, had set in motion the complete dismantling of his carefully constructed facade. I closed my office door and headed toward the conference room, my steps measured and confident. The past was properly archived, its lessons incorporated but its hold released. Ahead lay possibilities limited only by my vision and determination, a future built on the solid foundation of knowing exactly what I owned, what I was worth, and what I was capable of achieving. Rob had learned those facts too late. I had known them all along. The settlement conference proceeded exactly as I had anticipated. Rob's attorney, William Dalton, entered the elegant conference room with an air of forced confidence that quickly dissolved under Marcus's methodical questioning. The final agreement exceeded even my carefully calculated expectations. Full acknowledgement of my property rights, complete separation of finances, and a substantial cash settlement that represented not generosity, but restitution. They folded, more quickly than I expected, Marcus observed as we left the downtown law firm. Dalton barely attempted to negotiate once we mentioned the offshore accounts. "Fear is a powerful motivator," I replied, stepping into the elevator. "And right now, Rob has much to fear." The weeks that followed unfolded like the final movements of a chess match where every piece had been perfectly positioned. The judge approved our settlement without hesitation, noting the unusual thoroughness of the documentation. Rob's professional license was formally suspended pending the regulatory investigation's outcome. Cascade Financial announced a restructuring that conspicuously omitted several senior advisors, including Rob. Most telling was the complete absence of Natalie from recent developments. According to Grace's sources, she had departed Oregon entirely, leaving no forwarding address. On a crisp autumn morning exactly 6 months after I had first watched Rob and Natalie entering Cascade Financial together, I stood in my hospital office reviewing the architectural plans for our pediatric wing expansion. The morning's business update played quietly on my office television, background noise until a familiar name caught my attention. Breaking news in the ongoing Cascade Financial investigation. the business reporter announced. Managing partner James Holloway and former senior advisor Robert Bennett have been formally charged with multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and fiduciary breach. Regulatory authorities cite evidence of systematic misrepresentation of investment performance dating back at least 4 years. The screen displayed side-by-side photos, Holloway from a recent charity gala, looking confident and commanding. Beside it, a jarringly different image of Rob being escorted from the courthouse, unshaven and diminished, his eyes downcast to avoid the cameras. I muted the television and returned to my work. That chapter was closed. The legal system would process Rob's professional misconduct without any further involvement from me. His choices had led him to this point, just as my choices had led me to mine. My intercom buzzed. "Dr. Morrison would like to see you when you have a moment," my assistant announced. "I'll be right there," I replied, gathering the pediatric wing. Proposal. The hospital CEO greeted me with unusual formality, closing his office door before gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Emma, I wanted to discuss this with you before it becomes official. The board has unanimously approved your promotion to Chief Operations Officer." I accepted the news with appropriately measured appreciation. This advancement had been part of my professional strategy for years, carefully cultivated through exemplary performance, strategic relationship building, and patient positioning. Additionally, Dr. Morrison continued, there's the matter of your ex-husband's situation. Obviously, the board is aware of the recent charges against Mr. Bennett and Cascade Financial. We want to ensure you know we consider this entirely separate from your exceptional work here. I appreciate that, Thomas, I replied, my tone professional but warm. As I've maintained throughout, my personal matters have been managed independently of my professional responsibilities. Precisely why we're so confident in this promotion, he affirmed. Your ability to navigate personal challenges while maintaining absolute professional focus speaks volumes about your character. As I left his office with congratulations and my new title, I reflected on the irony. Rob's attempts to undermine me had ultimately accelerated my professional advancement. His betrayal had created the very opportunity for promotion that might otherwise have taken another year to achieve. That evening, I returned to my Laurelhurst home, entirely redecorated now, every trace of Rob's presence eliminated through thoughtful renovation and redesign. The grand Craftsman had always been structurally mine. Now it reflected my aesthetic sensibilities exclusively. No compromises, no accommodations for anyone else's preferences. Grace arrived at 7 with a bottle of champagne and her characteristic perceptiveness. "Congratulations, Chief Operations Officer Bennett," she said, embracing me briefly before stepping into the newly redesigned living room. The hospital board finally recognized what we've always known. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the champagne and her embrace with genuine warmth. Grace had been more than my attorney's contact throughout this process. She had been my strategist, my confidant, and ultimately, my friend. The timing worked out perfectly. "Speaking of timing," she said, settling onto the new sectional sofa that replaced the leather monstrosity Rob had insisted upon, "have you seen the latest on Rob's case?" "Just the morning announcement about the formal charges." "There's more," Grace said, accepting the champagne flute I offered. "My contact at the Regulatory Commission says Rob is negotiating a plea deal, full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. He's apparently providing extensive documentation about Holloway's involvement and the entire network of questionable accounts. I absorbed this information with detached interest. Self-preservation to the end." "Exactly," Grace agreed. "Though in this case, his self-interest may serve the public good by exposing the full extent of the Cascade deception." "Unintended consequences," I observed, the constant companion of poor decisions. We toasted my promotion and the effective conclusion of the Cascade Financial chapter. As we enjoyed the excellent champagne, Grace provided additional updates gleaned from her extensive professional network. Natalie had apparently resurfaced in Arizona under her maiden name, working as an executive assistant at a community college. Holloway was facing not just professional sanctions, but potential criminal prosecution. And most satisfyingly, 3 former clients had filed civil suits against Rob personally, ensuring that whatever financial resources remained to him would be consumed by legal defense for years to come. Comprehensive consequences, Grace noted, summarizing the situation. Professional, personal, financial, not a single aspect of his life left intact. He made comprehensive choices, I replied without malice. Each action interconnected with the others, forming a complete pattern of misconduct. The consequences merely mirror that pattern. After Grace departed, I moved through my reclaimed home, appreciating the tranquility of spaces defined entirely by my preferences. In the study, formerly Rob's domain with its dark woods and leather, now transformed into a light-filled reading room, I opened my secure files and reviewed the final documentation of this chapter. The divorce decree, finalized and filed. The property deed, reconfirmed and recorded with additional notations to prevent future challenges. The settlement funds, transferred to my separate accounts and strategically reinvested. The promotion announcement, officially scheduled for Monday's hospital staff meeting. Each document represented a milestone in the methodical reclamation of my life and the establishment of my future trajectory. I closed the files, encrypted the system, and moved to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. As I chopped vegetables with practiced precision, my phone rang. An unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Emma. Rob's voice, unfamiliar now after months without contact. He sounded diminished, the confident timbre replaced by something hollowed out. I know I'm not supposed to call you directly. Then why are you? I asked, my tone neither harsh nor accommodating. I'm finalizing my plea agreement tomorrow, he said. I'll be formally admitting to multiple federal charges. Before that happens, I needed to say something to you directly. I considered hanging up, enforcing the non-contact provision of our settlement. But clinical curiosity won out. What possible justification could he offer at this juncture? I'm listening, I said, continuing to prepare my meal as if this interruption warranted no pause in my routine. You were right, he said, the words emerging with apparent difficulty. About everything. The house. The finances. Cascade. Natalie. I deluded myself into believing I was the architect of our success when you were the foundation all along. I remained silent, neither affirming nor denying his belated recognition. I underestimated you, he continued into the silence. I thought I knew you completely, but I never really saw you at all, did I? No, I confirmed simply. You didn't. How did you know? He asked, a question that seemed to hold genuine bewilderment rather than accusation. About the offshore accounts, about Holloway's involvement. Even my attorney was shocked by how much you'd uncovered. I paid attention, I replied, to details, to patterns, to inconsistencies. I observed rather than assumed. I verified rather than trusted. Basic diligence that you mistook for naivety. A long pause followed, filled only by his audible breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to near whisper. I've lost everything. You forfeited everything, I corrected him. There's a difference. Is there? The question seemed genuine. Loss happens to you. Forfeiture is the result of your choices. Another lengthy silence. I finished preparing my meal and plated it with the same care I would have used had this conversation not been occurring. I don't suppose there's any possibility of, he began. No, I interrupted, my tone final but not cruel. There isn't. I understand, he said, though his voice suggested the opposite. I just thought, given everything that's happened, that's the fundamental issue, Rob, I said, setting my plate on the dining table. You still don't recognize that everything that's happened is the direct consequence of your actions, not some external circumstance that victimized us both. You forfeited our marriage when you chose deception. You forfeited our home when you brought Natalie into it. You forfeited your career when you compromised your professional ethics. These weren't things that happened to you. They were results you created. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, perhaps finally weighted with genuine understanding. I never deserved you, he said finally. That's the first accurate assessment you've made in our entire conversation, I replied. Goodbye, Rob. Please respect the non-contact agreement going forward. I ended the call and blocked the number, then sat down to enjoy my dinner. His call had been illuminating, but not in the way he likely intended. Even now, facing federal charges and professional ruin, Rob still viewed himself as the protagonist in a tragedy rather than the architect of a collapse. His fundamental inability to fully recognize his agency in creating these circumstances remained his blind spot, and would likely lead to similar patterns in whatever life he reconstructed after the legal consequences played out. The following morning brought a text from Marcus. Bennett signed plea agreement. Sentencing recommendation 18 to 24 months plus restitution. Holloway fighting charges. Trial date pending. I acknowledged the update without commentary. The legal resolution had always been inevitable once the regulatory investigation began in earnest. Rob's misconduct had been too extensive, too documented, too interconnected with larger schemes to escape significant consequences. The precise duration of his sentence was merely a detail in a conclusion that had been determined months ago by his own actions. That weekend, I finalized the last elements of my home renovation. New art selected specifically for each room. Custom bookshelves built to showcase my collection. The garden redesigned with perennials that would mature over years rather than seasons. Each choice reflected not just aesthetic preference, but philosophical outlook. Investments in permanence, in sustainability, in structures designed to evolve and strengthen over time. On Sunday evening, as golden autumn light filtered through the newly installed stained glass accent window in my study, Grace called with one final update on the Cascade Financial situation. Regulatory documents filed today confirm what we suspected, she said. Natalie wasn't just Rob's mistress or even just a spotter for vulnerable advisors. She was Holloway's plant from the beginning, placed specifically to identify and compromise individuals who could be recruited into the scheme. Rob was targeted because of his combination of ambition, financial overextension, and ethical flexibility. Interesting, I said, considering this confirmation of my earlier suspicions. So their relationship was strategic rather than romantic on both sides. Apparently, Grace confirmed. The regulatory filing quotes communications between Holloway and Natalie discussing Rob's susceptibility to flattery and useful insecurities. They assessed him as ideally manipulable. I felt an unexpected flicker of something almost like pity, not for Rob's current circumstances, which remained entirely self-created, but for the fundamental weakness that had made him such an easy target. His desperate need for validation, his hunger for recognition, his willingness to compromise principles for appearance, these qualities had made him vulnerable to exploitation by people who recognized and weaponized those very traits. Will this affect his sentencing? I asked. Unlikely, Grace replied. Being manipulated doesn't negate his willing participation once recruited, though his attorneys may attempt to position him as a victim of a larger conspiracy. That would be consistent with his self-perception, I noted, remembering our recent conversation. After ending the call, I sat in my study as evening shadows lengthened across the hardwood floors. The story had come full circle from that rainy afternoon when I first watched Rob and Natalie entering Cascade Financial together. I had observed, analyzed, planned, and executed a comprehensive response to betrayal, not from emotional reactivity, but from strategic clarity. The results surrounded me now, my home secured, my career advancing, my future unencumbered by the weight of a relationship founded on illusion. I had not just survived Rob's betrayal, I had transformed it into an opportunity for recalibration and growth. The following morning, I prepared for my first day as Chief Operations Officer with the same methodical attention I brought to every aspect of my life. As I dressed in a new suit selected specifically for this milestone, I reviewed the journey that had led to this moment. The careful documentation of Rob's infidelity, the strategic timing of my disappearance, the meticulous reclamation of my home, the precise navigation of legal proceedings. Each step had been calculated, each response measured, each outcome anticipated. I had transformed potential devastation into deliberate renovation, replacing what was damaged with something stronger, more authentic, and entirely mine. I finished dressing, gathered my materials for the day, and took one final look around. My bedroom, now a sanctuary of calm with its serene colors and thoughtful design. On my dresser sat the silver paperweight Grace had given me, its single word catching the morning light. Vindicated. I picked it up, feeling its solid weight in my palm. Not just vindicated, I thought. Validated, verified, victorious. Robbie had introduced his mistress as his executive assistant, believing the thinly veiled deception would go unchallenged, just as he had moved her into a house he mistakenly believed was partly his, conducted financial transactions he incorrectly assumed were untraceable, and betrayed a wife he fatally underestimated. I had introduced myself as his new landlord, revealing the truth beneath his illusions and setting in motion the inevitable consequences of his choices. In the end, the lesson was elegant in its simplicity. Pay attention to the details. Read the fine print, verify ownership, recognize value, or risk losing everything to someone who does. I placed the paperweight back on my dresser, collected my keys, and headed toward my car. Ahead lay a day of new responsibilities, expanded authority, and continuing opportunity, all built on the foundation of knowing exactly what I owned, what I was worth, and what I was capable of achieving. The settlement conference proceeded exactly as I had anticipated. Rob's attorney, William Dalton, entered the elegant conference room with an air of forced confidence that quickly dissolved under Marcus's methodical questioning. The final agreement exceeded even my carefully calculated expectations. Full acknowledgement of my property rights, complete separation of finances, and a substantial cash settlement that represented not generosity, but restitution. They folded more quickly than I expected, Marcus observed as we left the downtown law firm. Dalton barely attempted to negotiate once we mentioned the offshore accounts. Fear is a powerful motivator, I replied, stepping into the elevator. And right now, Rob has much to fear. I remembered something my grandmother once told me. Patience is not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting. My patience had paid off in ways even I hadn't fully anticipated. The weeks that followed unfolded like the final movements of a chess match, where every piece had been perfectly positioned. The judge approved our settlement without hesitation, noting the unusual thoroughness of the documentation. Rob's professional license was formally suspended pending the regulatory investigation's outcome. Cascade Financial announced a restructuring that conspicuously omitted several senior advisors, including Rob. Most telling was the complete absence of Natalie from recent developments. According to Grace's sources, she had departed Oregon entirely, leaving no forwarding address. As Maya Angelou wisely observed, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I had finally learned to believe what Rob had been showing me for years. On a crisp autumn morning exactly 6 months after I had first watched Rob and Natalie entering Cascade Financial together, I stood in my hospital office reviewing the architectural plans for our pediatric wing expansion. The morning's business update played quietly on my office television, background noise until a familiar name caught my attention. Breaking news in the ongoing Cascade Financial investigation, the business reporter announced. Managing partner James Holloway and former senior advisor Robert Bennett have been formally charged with multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and fiduciary breach. Regulatory authorities cite evidence of systematic misrepresentation of investment performance dating back at least 4 years. The screen displayed side-by-side photos, Holloway from a recent charity gala, looking confident and commanding. Beside it, a jarringly different image of Rob being escorted from the courthouse, unshaven and diminished, his eyes downcast to avoid the cameras. I muted the television and returned to my work. That chapter was closed. The legal system would process Rob's professional misconduct without any further involvement from me. His choices had led him to this point, just as my choices had led me to mine. Your life does not get better by chance, as Jim Rohn said. It gets better by change. My intercom buzzed. Dr. Morrison would like to see you when you have a moment, my assistant announced. I'll be right there, I replied, gathering the pediatric wing proposal. The hospital CEO greeted me with unusual formality, closing his office door before gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Emma, I wanted to discuss this with you before it becomes official. The board has unanimously approved your promotion to Chief Operations Officer. I accepted the news with appropriately measured appreciation. This advancement had been part of my professional strategy for years, carefully cultivated through exemplary performance, strategic relationship building, and patient positioning. Additionally, Dr. Morrison continued, there's the matter of your ex-husband's situation. Obviously, the board is aware of the recent charges against Mr. Bennett and Cascade Financial. We want to ensure you know we consider this entirely separate from your exceptional work here. I appreciate that, Thomas, I replied, my tone professional but warm. As I've maintained throughout, my personal matters have been managed independently of my professional responsibilities. Precisely why we're so confident in this promotion, he affirmed. Your ability to navigate personal challenges while maintaining absolute professional focus speaks volumes about your character. As I left his office with congratulations and my new title, I reflected on the irony. Rob's attempts to undermine me had ultimately accelerated my professional advancement. His betrayal had created the very opportunity for promotion that might otherwise have taken another year to achieve. Eleanor Roosevelt's words echoed in my mind. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I had never given that consent, not even in my darkest moments. That evening, I returned to my Laurelhurst home, entirely redecorated now, every trace of Rob's presence eliminated through thoughtful renovation and redesign. The grand Craftsman had always been structurally mine. Now it reflected my aesthetic. Sensibilities exclusively. No compromises, no accommodations for anyone else's preferences. Grace arrived at 7 with a bottle of champagne and her characteristic perceptiveness. Congratulations, Chief Operations Officer Bennett, she said, embracing me briefly before stepping into the newly redesigned living room. The hospital board finally recognized what we've always known. Thank you, I replied, accepting the champagne and her embrace with genuine warmth. Grace had been more than my attorney's contact throughout this process. She had been my strategist, my confidant, and ultimately, my friend. The timing worked out perfectly. Speaking of timing, she said, settling onto the new sectional sofa that replaced the leather monstrosity Rob had insisted upon. Have you seen the latest on Rob's case? Just the morning announcement about the formal charges. There's more, Grace said, accepting the champagne flute I offered. My contact at the Regulatory Commission says Rob is negotiating a plea deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. He's apparently providing extensive documentation about Holloway's involvement and the entire network of questionable accounts. I absorbed this information with detached interest. Self-preservation to the end. Exactly, Grace agreed. Though in this case, his self-interest may serve the public good by exposing the full extent of the Cascade deception. Unintended consequences, I observed. The constant companion of poor decisions. Coco Chanel's wisdom came to mind. The most courageous act is still to think for yourself, aloud. I had finally found the courage to think for myself and act. Accordingly, regardless of societal expectations about marriage or divorce, we toasted my promotion and the effective conclusion of the Cascade Financial chapter. As we enjoyed the excellent champagne, Grace provided additional updates gleaned from her extensive professional network. Natalie had apparently resurfaced in Arizona under her maiden name, working as an administrative assistant at a local community college. Holloway was facing not just professional sanctions, but potential criminal prosecution. And most satisfyingly, 3 former clients had filed civil suits against Rob personally, ensuring that whatever financial resources remained to him would be consumed by legal defense for years to come. Comprehensive consequences, Grace noted, summarizing the situation. Professional, personal, financial. Not a single aspect of his life left intact. He made comprehensive choices, I replied. Without malice, each action interconnected with the others, forming a complete pattern of misconduct. The consequences merely mirror that pattern. After Grace departed, I moved through my reclaimed home, appreciating the tranquility of spaces defined entirely by my preferences. In the study, formerly Rob's domain with its dark woods and leather, now transformed into a light-filled reading room, I opened my secure files and reviewed the final documentation of this chapter. The divorce decree, finalized and filed. The property deed, reconfirmed and recorded with additional notations to prevent future challenges. The settlement funds, transferred to my separate accounts and strategically reinvested. The promotion announcement, officially scheduled for Monday's hospital staff meeting. Each document represented a milestone in the methodical reclamation of my life and the establishment of my future trajectory. As Audre Lorde so powerfully stated, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. I had moved beyond fear to focused determination. I closed the files, encrypted the system, and moved to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. As I chopped vegetables with practiced precision, my phone rang. An unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Emma. Rob's voice, unfamiliar now after months without contact. He sounded diminished, the confident timbre replaced by something hollowed out. I know I'm not supposed to call you directly. Then why are you? I asked, my tone neither harsh nor accommodating. I'm finalizing my plea agreement tomorrow, he said. I'll be formally admitting to multiple federal charges. Before that happens, I needed to say something to you directly. I considered hanging up, enforcing the non-contact provision of our settlement. But clinical curiosity won out. What possible justification could he offer at this juncture? I'm listening, I said, continuing to prepare my meal as if this interruption warranted no pause in my routine. You were right, he said, the words emerging with apparent difficulty. About everything, the house, the finances, Cascade, Natalie. I deluded myself into believing I was the architect of our success when you were the foundation all along. I remained silent, neither affirming nor denying his belated recognition. I underestimated you, he continued into the silence. I thought I knew you completely, but I never really saw you at all, did I? No, I confirmed simply. You didn't. Oprah Winfrey once said, "Turn your wounds into wisdom." I had done exactly that. transforming betrayal into strategic enlightenment. "How did you know?" he asked, a question that seemed to hold genuine bewilderment rather than accusation. About the offshore accounts, about Holloway's involvement. Even, my attorney was shocked by how much you'd uncovered. "I paid attention," I replied, "to details, to patterns, to inconsistencies. I observed rather than assumed. I verified rather than trusted. Basic diligence that you mistook for naivety." A long pause followed, filled only by his audible breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to near whisper. "I've lost everything." "You forfeited everything," I corrected him. "There's a difference." "Is there?" The question seemed genuine. Loss happens to you. Forfeiture is the result of your choices. Another lengthy silence. I finished preparing my meal and plated it with the same care I would have used had this conversation not been occurring. "I don't suppose there's any possibility of," he began. "No," I interrupted, my tone final but not cruel. "There isn't." "I understand," he said, though his voice suggested the opposite. "I just thought, given everything that's happened." "That's the fundamental issue, Rob," I said, setting my plate on the dining table. "You still don't recognize that everything that's happened is the direct consequence of your actions, not some external circumstance that victimized us both. You forfeited our marriage when you chose deception. You forfeited our home when you brought Natalie into it. You forfeited your career when you compromised your professional ethics. These weren't things that happened to you. They were results you created." The silence that followed felt different, heavier, perhaps finally weighted with genuine understanding. "I never deserved you," he said finally. "That's the first accurate assessment you've made in our entire conversation," I replied. "Goodbye, Rob. Please respect the non-contact agreement going forward." I ended the call and blocked the number, then sat down to enjoy my dinner. His call had been illuminating, but not in the way he likely intended. Even now, facing federal charges and professional ruin, Rob still viewed himself as the protagonist in a tragedy rather than the architect of a collapse. His fundamental inability to fully recognize his agency in creating these circumstances remained his blind spot, and would likely lead to similar patterns in whatever life he reconstructed after the legal consequences played out. As Brené Brown wisely notes, owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. The following morning brought a text from Marcus. Bennett signed plea agreement, sentencing recommendation 18 to 24 months plus restitution. Holloway fighting charges, trial date pending. I acknowledged the update without commentary. The legal resolution had always been inevitable once the regulatory investigation began in earnest. Rob's misconduct had been too extensive, too documented, too interconnected with larger schemes to escape significant consequences. The precise duration of his sentence was merely a detail in a conclusion that had been determined months ago by his own actions. That weekend, I finalized the last elements of my home renovation. New art selected specifically for each room, custom bookshelves built to showcase my collection, the garden redesigned with perennials that would mature over years rather than seasons. Each choice reflected not just aesthetic preference but philosophical outlook, investments in permanence, in sustainability, in structures designed to evolve and strengthen over time. Michelle Obama's reflection resonated with me. For me, becoming isn't about arriving somewhere or achieving a certain aim. I see it as forward motion, a means of evolving, a way to reach continuously toward a better self. On Sunday evening, as golden autumn light filtered through the newly installed stained glass accent window in my study, Grace called with one final update on the Cascade Financial situation. "Regulatory documents filed today confirm what we suspected," she said. "Natalie wasn't just Rob's mistress, or even just a spotter for vulnerable advisors. She was Holloway's plant from the beginning, placed specifically to identify and compromise individuals who could be recruited into the scheme." Rob was targeted because of his combination of ambition, financial overextension, and ethical flexibility. Interesting, I said, considering this confirmation of my earlier suspicions. So their relationship was strategic rather than romantic on both sides. Apparently, Grace confirmed. The regulatory filing quotes communications between Holloway and Natalie discussing Rob's susceptibility to flattery and useful insecurities. They assessed him as ideally manipulable. I felt an unexpected flicker of something almost like pity, not for Rob's current circumstances, which remained entirely self-created, but for the fundamental weakness that had made him such an easy target. His desperate need for validation, his hunger for recognition, his willingness to compromise principles for appearance, these qualities had made him vulnerable to exploitation by people who recognized and weaponized those very traits. Will this affect his sentencing? I asked. Unlikely, Grace replied. Being manipulated doesn't negate his willing participation once recruited, though his attorneys may attempt to position him as a victim of a larger conspiracy. That would be consistent with his self-perception, I noted, remembering our recent conversation. After ending the call, I sat in my study as evening shadows lengthened across the hardwood floors. The story had come full circle from that rainy afternoon when I first watched Rob and Natalie entering Cascade Financial together. I had observed, analyzed, planned, and executed a comprehensive response to betrayal, not from emotional reactivity, but from strategic clarity. The results surrounded me now, my home secured, my career advancing, my future unencumbered by the weight of a relationship founded on illusion. I had not just survived Rob's betrayal, I had transformed it into an opportunity for recalibration and growth. Sometimes when things are falling apart, they may actually be falling into place, as Rumi so eloquently put it. The following morning, I prepared for my first day as Chief Operations Officer with the same methodical attention I brought to every aspect of my life. As I dressed in a new suit selected specifically for this milestone, I reviewed the journey that had led to this moment. The careful documentation of Rob's infidelity, the strategic timing of my disappearance, the meticulous reclamation of my home, the precise navigation of legal proceedings. Each step had been calculated, each response measured, each outcome anticipated. I had transformed potential devastation into deliberate renovation, replacing what was damaged with something stronger, more authentic, and entirely mine. I finished dressing, gathered my materials for the day, and took one final look around. My bedroom, now a sanctuary of calm with its serene colors and thoughtful design. On my dresser sat the silver paperweight Grace had given me, its single word catching the morning light: vindicated. I picked it up, feeling its solid weight in my palm. Not just vindicated, I thought. Validated, verified, victorious. Rob had introduced his mistress as his executive assistant, believing the thinly veiled deception would go unchallenged, just as he had moved her into a house he mistakenly believed was partly his, conducted financial transactions he incorrectly assumed were untraceable, and betrayed a wife he fatally underestimated. I had introduced myself as his new landlord, revealing the truth beneath his illusions, and setting in motion the inevitable consequences of his choices. In the end, the lesson was elegant in its simplicity. Pay attention to the details. Read the fine print. Verify ownership. Recognize value. Or risk losing everything to someone who does. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg wisely advised, real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. I had taken those steps deliberately, strategically, and with absolute clarity of purpose. I placed the paperweight back on my dresser, collected my keys, and headed toward my car. Ahead lay a day of new responsibilities, expanded authority, and continuing opportunity, all built on the foundation of knowing exactly what I owned, what I was worth, and what I was capable of achieving. Up next, you've got two more standout Stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.